is permanent. Streets would be rerouted, renamed. Areas you had not seen in a while then would become unfamiliar. Among other things, this would contribute to older people feeling that it was time to move on. People would feel they couldn't even keep up now with the changes in areas that were once familiar. Vacant buildings would be left to stand empty and to deteriorate, and streets would be allowed to deteriorate in certain localities. The purpose of this was to provide the jungle a depressed atmosphere for the unfit. Somewhere in this same connection he mentioned buildings and bridges would be made so that they would collapse after a while. There would be more accidents involving airplanes and railroads and automobiles. All of this to contribute to the feeling of insecurity, that nothing was safe. Not too long after this presentation, and I think one or two even before, in the area where I live, we had some newly constructed bridge to break, another newly constructed bridge defect discovered before it broke, and I remember reading just scattered incidents around the country where shopping malls would fall in right where they were filled with shoppers. And I remember that one of the shopping malls in our area, first building I'd ever been in where you could feel this vibration throughout the entire building when there were a lot of people in there. And I remember wondering at that time whether this shopping mall was one of the buildings he was talking about. Talking to construction people and architects about it, they'd say, "Oh no, that's good. Buildings vibrate like that. That means it's flexible and not rigid." Well, maybe so. We'll wait and see. Other areas, though, would be well maintained. Not every part of the city would be slummed. There would be the created slums and other areas well maintained. Those people able to leave the slum for better areas then would learn to better appreciate the importance of human accomplishment. This meant that if they left the jungle and came to civilization, so to speak, they could be proud of their own accomplishments, that they made it. There was no related sympathy for those who were left behind in the jungle of drugs and deteriorating neighborhoods. And then a statement that was kind of surprising: we think we can effectively limit crime to the slum areas so it won't be spread heavily into better areas. I should maybe point out here, these are obviously not word-for-word quotations after 20 years, but where I say that I'm quoting, I'm giving the general drift of what was said close to word for word, perhaps not precisely so. But anyhow, I remember wondering, how can you be so confident that the criminal element is going to stay where you want it to stay? But he went on to say there would be increased security would be needed in the better areas. That would mean more police, better coordinated police efforts. He did not say so, but I wondered at that time about the moves that were afoot to consolidate all the police departments of suburbs around major cities. I think the John Birch Society was one who was saying, support your local police, don't let them be consolidated. And I remember wondering if that was one of the things he had in mind about security. It was not explicitly stated. But anyhow, he went on to say there would be a whole new industry of residential security systems to develop, with alarms and locks and alarms going into the police department so that people could protect their wealth and their well-being. Because some of the criminal activity would spill out of the slums into better, more affluent-looking areas that looked like they'd be worth burglarizing. But, and again, it was stated like as a redeeming quality, see, we're generating all this more crime, but look how good we are. We're also generating the means for you to protect yourself against the crime. Sort of repeated thing throughout this presentation was the recognized evil, and then the self-forgiveness, saying, well, see, we've given you a way out. American industry came under discussion. It was the first that I'd heard of the term global interdependence, or that notion. The stated plan was that different parts of the world would be assigned different roles of industry and commerce in a unified global system. The continued preeminence of the United States and the relative independence and self-sufficiency of the United States would have to be changed. This was one of the several times where he said, in order to create a new structure, you first have to tear down the old. And American industry was one example of that. Our system would have to be curtailed in order to give other countries a chance to build their industries, because otherwise they would not be able to compete against the United States. And this was especially true of our heavy industries that would be cut back while the same industries were being developed in other countries, notably Japan. And at this point there was some discussion of steel, and particularly automobiles. I remember saying that automobiles would be imported from Japan on a equal footing with our own domestically produced automobiles, but the Japanese product would be better. Things would be made so they would break and fall apart. That is in the United States. So that people would tend to prefer the imported variety, and this would give a bit of a boost to foreign competitors. One example was Japanese. In 1969, Japanese automobiles, if they were sold here at all, I don't remember, but they certainly weren't very popular. But the idea was you would get a little bit disgusted with your Ford, GM, or Chrysler product or whatever, because little things like window handles would fall off more, and plastic parts would break that, had they been made of metal, would hold up. Your patriotism about buying American would soon give way to practicality, that if you bought Japanese or German or imported, that it would last longer and you'd be better off. Patriotism would go down the drain then. There was mention elsewhere of things being made to fall apart too. One of the, I don't remember specific items that, if they were even stated, other than automobiles, but I do recall having the impression, sort of in my imagination, of a surgeon having something fall apart in his hands in the operating room at a critical time. Was he including this sort of thing in his discussion? But somewhere in this discussion about things being made deliberately defective and unreliable, not only was to tear down patriotism, but to be just a little source of irritation to people who would use such things. Again, the idea that you not feel terribly secure, promoting the notion that the world isn't a terribly reliable place. The United States was to be kept strong in information, communications, high technology, education, and agriculture. The United States was seen as continuing to be sort of the keystone of this global system, but heavy industry would be transported out. One of the comments made about heavy industry was we had had enough environmental damage from smokestacks and industrial waste, and some of the other people could put up with that for a while. This again was supposed to be a redeeming quality for Americans to accept. You took away our industry, but you saved our environment. So we really didn't lose anything. And along this line, there were talks, there was then discussion about people losing their jobs as a result of industry, and opportunities for retraining, and particularly population shifts would be brought about. This is sort of an aside, but I think I'll explore the aside before I forget it more. Population shifts were to be brought about so that people would be tending to move into the Sun Belt. There would be sort of people without roots in their new locations, and traditions are easier to change in a place where there are a lot of transplanted people as compared to trying to change traditions in a place where people grew up and had an extended family where they had roots. Things like new medical care systems, if you pick up from Northeast Industrial City and you transplant yourself to the South, Sun Belt, or Southwest, you'll be more accepting of whatever kind of, for example, controlled medical care you find there than you would accept a change in the medical care system where you had roots and the support of your family. Also in this vein, it was mentioned that he used the plural personal pronoun we. We take control first of the port cities, New York, San Francisco, Seattle. The idea being that this is a piece of strategy, the idea being that if you control the port cities with your philosophy and your way of life, the heartland in between has to yield. I can't elaborate more on that, but it is interesting that if you look around, the most liberal areas in the country, and progressively so, are the seacoast cities. The heartland, the Midwest, does seem to have maintained its conservatism. But as you take away industry and jobs and relocate people, then this is a strategy to break down conservatism. When you take away industry and people are unemployed and poor, they will accept whatever change seems to offer them survival, and their morals and their commitment to things will all give way to survival. That's not my philosophy, that's the speaker's philosophy. Anyhow, going back to industry, some heavy industry would remain just enough to maintain sort of a seed bit of industrial skills, which could be expanded if the plan didn't work out as it was intended, so that the country would not be devoid of assets and skills. But this was just sort of a contingency plan. It was hoped and expected that the worldwide specialization would be carried on. But perhaps repeating myself, but one of the upshots of all of this is that with this global interdependence, then national identities would tend to be de-emphasized. Each area dependent on every other area for one or another elements in its life. We would all become citizens of the world rather than citizens of any one country. And along these lines, then we can talk about sports. Sports in the United States was to be changed in part as a way of de-emphasizing nationalism. Soccer, a worldwide sport, was to be emphasized and pushed in the United States. And this was of interest because in this area, the game of soccer was virtually unknown at that time. I had a few friends who attended an elementary school other than the one I attended where they played soccer at their school, and they were a real novelty. This was back in the 50s. So to hear this man speak of soccer in this area was kind of surprising. But anyhow, soccer is seen as an international sport and would be promoted, and the traditional sport of American baseball would be de-emphasized and possibly eliminated.